Hello and welcome to Clusters. Last week we saw how Stephen, a disciple of Jesus Christ and a man full of God's grace and power, had been upsetting the members of a synagogue by the wonders he was performing. They tried arguing with him, but the Holy Spirit gave him great words of wisdom to speak. As a result, some men were persuaded to lie about what he'd been preaching about. They accused him of uttering blasphemies against both Moses and God, and so he's arrested and dragged before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious council. These false witnesses give evidence that he'd spoken against the temple and against the law of Moses. Now at the beginning of chapter 7, Stephen is asked by the high priest himself, are these charges true? This is Stephen's chance, and he takes hold of it with both hands. What he does is to take the Sanhedrin through much of Israel's history, starting with Abraham and God's promises to him. Although he had no son, God promised both descendants and a land for them to live in. This culminated in the miraculous birth of his son Isaac, who in turn was the father of Jacob, who was the father of 12 sons, the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. The fulfillment had begun. Stephen then briefly relates the story of one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, how he was rejected by his brothers and sold into slavery in Egypt. Yet God protected Joseph, who found favour with Pharaoh, who set him to rule all Egypt. A famine drew his brothers to where Joseph was in charge of grain distribution. The family was reunited and settled in Egypt. But in line with prophecy, the Israelites were enslaved there, and Stephen spends a fair chunk of his talk showing how Moses was rejected by the Israelites, both before and after their rescue from slavery, as was God, when the people turned to worshipping idols. Stephen also talks about the tabernacle, the tent where God's presence manifested on earth until the time of Solomon, when a permanent temple was built for him to dwell. But Stephen notes that through the prophet Isaiah, God declared that he dwells in heaven and can't be limited to a place built by human hands. By the time of Jesus, God's glory cloud had been withdrawn from the temple in Jerusalem. Yet as Jesus entered the temple, God's presence returned, largely unnoticed. You might want to discuss how this was possible. You might also want to think about the temple God resides in today, in this world. And Stephen concludes by likening the current council in Jerusalem to their ancestors who'd rejected and persecuted the great prophets of the past because they'd rejected and crucified God's own son, Jesus. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the council members are livid. But Stephen looks to the heavens and says that he sees God's glory in heaven, the glory that the religious Jews believed was in the temple, and that the right hand of God was Jesus, the one they'd murdered. Stephen is dragged out of the city and stoned to death, but his final words are quite remarkable, as is the man, Saul, who's mentioned as holding the coats of Stephen's killers. It's a long chapter that's quite involved, but I hope you can use the questions down below to delve deeper into Stephen's speech as he becomes the first martyr of the Christian church. Next week is Trinity Together, and it'll be a privilege to join you all for prayer in church. But for now, have a great cluster.